Hello and welcome to the Property Roundup on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on the new trends emerging within the property industry. The show is brought to you in partnership with Property District, your industry communications partner. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Hannigan, CEO of Circle VHA, to talk about social housing and maybe what's happening at the moment and look beyond the headlines, which can be very confusing. John, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Carol. Great to be here. Delighted to be on the show.
John, as I mentioned, when it comes to social housing delivery, and in fact all housing delivery, it can be difficult to look beyond the headlines. So you might just talk to us about, within Circle VHA, how you see the state of social housing delivery in 2023.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I agree with you. Even in the last weekend, we've seen three major announcements in respect of housing policy. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we're facing, is that we have multiple housing policy announcements on a daily basis. And I think that is confusing. I think for the person who's living at home, looking at what they can do in terms of getting on the ladder, not getting on the ladder, going into rented accommodation, whatever it might be, knowing where to start even is very difficult. And I've been saying in the last 6 months particularly, that we are gone beyond a housing crisis. I think we are in a housing emergency. And don't get me wrong, I do think the government are trying hard. So it's not a case of, nobody's trying to do the best they can. But the reality is that I think I don't believe we're taking the right approaches overall. We have more than 64,000 households. And people get confused with that because they say 64,000 people on the social housing waiting list. Actually, it's households. And if you take that on average, there's 2 to 3 people in each of those households. You're looking at potentially 150,000 people who need housing at this point in time. That's the official list. The unofficial list also incorporates, for example, the 80,000 or more refugees that we've had come in from different areas, including Ukraine, and also all those who are living in what's known as adequate housing, as the official term, at this point in time, where they're sleeping on their mother or father's couch, or they're couch surfing with friends. So I do believe we are in a very significant housing crisis, housing emergency. I think if you look back over the last few weeks, just in the last few weeks, you'll see that the number of homes that are available to rent down to single figures in certain areas, which is unsustainable in terms of a housing economy. So we need to be doing an awful lot more. So I think we're gone from a crisis. I think crisis was what we had pre-pandemic. I think what we have now is an emergency.
John, thank you so much for that. And I'm really glad that you've made that point and that distinction, because that distinction is an important one. It's not just one that will dictate the headlines or the media, or it's not just a soundbite. Actually, there's a huge difference between a crisis and an emergency in terms of the policymaking, the speed of policymaking, and how government can react. So in fact, actually, we've had several guests over the last at least 12 months call for this for our current state to be declared beyond a crisis and actually as an emergency. So from your perspective, if the government were to come out today and say, right, we are upgrading Ireland's housing crisis into an emergency, which means then they would have greater powers in terms of emergency type legislation, as we saw throughout the pandemic, what would you like to see happen to really address housing over, say if there was an emergency period of 24 months declared? What do you think could reasonably be done?
Okay, so I think one of the first things, and it's easy, and it can be done now, even in a crisis process, but it's not being done. The really easy one is, first of all, you get an all-party group together that is focused wholly on it. I am very sure that the current government are doing all that is within their power and their thinking to actually deliver what they can at this point in time. Okay, so I don't think there's anybody shirking their responsibilities at this point in time. I don't think there's anybody not trying their best to deal with what's happening. But no single ideology is going to actually make this work. I think there is a reliance on the market, which I absolutely think is appropriate as well, to actually make things happen. But it's not going to work on its own. It needs everybody, all actors working together. And I think the reality is we have too many actors who are doing their own thing as opposed to on a coordinated basis. And if I take my own sector as an example, we tend as approved housing bodies, housing associations, not to compete with each other. okay, because we can't. Local authorities are the mediators for that, or moderators for that, whichever way you want to look at it. And they kind of ensure that if there's a site that's to be developed, a single approved housing body is the one who will deal with it. So if somebody makes another request to do so, local authorities will go no. But we are competing against local authorities, and we are competing, for example, against the LDA, Land Development Agency, and we are competing against the private sector to develop housing. And I think the reality is that there needs to be a greater coordination process in respect of all of those different actors. There is room for everybody, and there's room for everybody to do what they need to do and to do what they're there to do. And from our perspective, that's to provide housing for people in need. But we actually need it on a more coordinated basis. And I think until we have that, and the only way we're going to get that is if we get a coordinated basis at the policy level. And I think to get a coordinated policy process, you need a multi-party approach. So I would suggest that if this was a war, for example, and we were in a war, you'd find all government parties and non-government parties working together in order to be able to resolve the issue. And I think that's where we're at, actually. So that's the first thing.
Okay, but John, just before you move forward, I mean, you're talking about, I accept what you're saying, that the government are doing all within their power and within their thinking to tackle housing. There is not a huge amount of diversity in our current government and opposition.
I would absolutely agree.
That's challenging the thinking that they just don't have the full scale of ability to think about beyond their current ideology around housing delivery.
And I think, again, great respect for all politicians. I think the job they do is fantastic. It's not a job I would put myself forward for. So I have huge respect for what they do. But I think the reality is that when you belong to a particular party, you belong to a particular ideology, an approach. For example, two of the current parties in power, very much market-led, very much market-driven, want the market to be the key deliverers and providers, albeit they are resourcing and funding. So, don't get me wrong, resourcing and funding other players within this process. But the talk is about we must have more home ownership. We must allow greater home ownership. We must encourage greater home ownership. I don't know why. We have one of the highest levels of home ownership within Europe and within the world, actually.
But it is falling. So from where we were decades ago, actually, we have disproportionately less.
Absolutely. Well, we've seen a greater fall than but actually it still needs to fall further. I think that's the point. And what we're seeing is we have a very small private rented sector, and no economy that's thriving around the world actually has a small private rented housing sector as we have at this point in time. And I don't believe that we should have a huge social housing sector, which is one of the ideologies from one of the other sectors where social and affordable housing should be provided only by the public, by the state. I think, and it becomes public housing. I think that's not right either. I think there needs to be a greater balance. And we have two parties on opposite sides of the agendas, as it were, saying that their ideology will work better. And the reality is we need both elements, but we need a bit in the middle that's actually protecting the landlord and the tenant that's in the private sector better, because we're seeing more and more of those landlords leave. And even from a social housing perspective, that's a huge issue, because the more landlords that leave, the more people that will become homeless or at risk of being homeless, the greater insecurity we create within our economy, the less available homes we have for those coming in from an FDI perspective, where companies want to invest in the country, but they're, even in the short term, they can't bring their people here because there's no private rental market. So we have to do something that actually bolsters that, which will have a great impact on both sides of the public housing side and the housing for sale side. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing a different approach and actually both sides of the equation talking two different policies in respect of it, where the reality is we need both moderated for the private rental sector in the middle.
I absolutely agree with you in terms of your call for balance. However, when you look at other jurisdictions that have a more developed and more mature and a larger private rented sector, they have alongside that a strong ethos of individual private investment. So people who are choosing not to go down the home ownership route, when it comes to retirement age, they have a comfortable mechanism by which they can continue to rent in the private rented sector throughout their retirement. Yes. We don't have that in Ireland. So if we grow our private rented sector, what happens to everybody when they hit retirement age? How are they going to sustain high levels of rent?
I absolutely agree. I think this is one of the key conundrums that's not being resolved and not even being addressed I think that's, again, I've created this term before. Others have started to use it, and I think it's probably right. I'm not sure it's exactly right, but it's nearly there. We need a sláinte care approach to housing, because I think what sláinte care, whether you agree or disagree with sláinte care, what it did is it brought together everybody to consider all of the big issues, and to work on them as a single group across the different parties. We need something similar. And I think that one issue that you've addressed, we have a huge growing demographic at this point in time of older persons over 55. In 20 years' time, that's going to be a significant population of the overall population, which is driving down the opportunity for our younger people to actually sustain the state going forward. So we have to find a way to enable those older persons to be able to, one, right size if they choose to do so, but two, to be able to continue to rent in the private sector if that's where they've been. I have a family member, won't mention, but who's been in that sector for quite a period of time and is facing quite a considerable concern for the future. They're getting slightly older, slightly younger than me, but getting there, and we're both getting there. They are going to face that difficulty in the future about how are they going to continue to rent. And it is a worry. And we don't have a solution. And I don't know that anybody has at this point.
You know, if you look at what was done, a decade ago through the special savings scheme, whereby, if you invest X, the state supports you with Y, given that anybody in the private rental sector, whether they're in their early 20s or they're in their 60s and 70s and beyond that, if there could be a similar allocation whereby you're paying rent, but a certain portion of that goes in to protect yourself beyond retirement age or beyond your ability to sustain yourself within the private rented sector. This feels like a very solvable problem. And when you talk about bringing all parties together, is that not what the Housing Commission was supposed to do?
I think, first of all, we haven't heard from the Housing Commission on everything that they've been asked to do yet. Okay, so let's give them a bit of time, because yes, there is an element of their thinking or an element of the work that is to do around the thinking of this issue, but we haven't heard from them in respect of it yet. I'm not sure that the Housing Commission is that. While it has brought together a whole range of politicians, councillors, people from the sector, different areas, different expertise, I still don't know that is exactly what it is. And its remit was to look 10 years out as well. So that's, we have an issue that we need to resolve today. And we have an issue that we need. Now, in fairness, I've said this on a regular basis as well, housing can't be resolved overnight, and housing won't be resolved in a period of 2 years. And I think part of it is that we have this sense of we must do more now in order to make things happen. Well, there are certain things we can do now that will help to stabilize, but not actually do what it needs to do, which is house everybody over time, or create the opportunity for housing over time. I think some things we need to do now are things like stabilize the security for current renters. I think that is something we could do today or tomorrow. We could pass legislation very quickly for that. We could do something in respect of keeping the landlords that are in the private sector in the sector today. That's utilizing either tax breaks in a particular way or utilizing some other methodology that allows them to invest in a way that gives them that level of security too. And we haven't addressed those issues. Now, there are two issues we can do immediately. We're already spending $4 billion a year on social and affordable housing. And there's been talks about increases in that over the last weekend in terms of what goes to developers to develop more affordable housing. So actually, money is not our problem in this state at this point in time. We've got 10 billion surplus next year, 12 billion the year after, 16 the year after that. So money is not our problem. There's a wall of money that could be invested in different ways. Our problem is that we're not targeting it at the places it needs to be as effectively as we could do.
John, it seems bizarre to me that somebody coming from the approved housing body sector is talking about the need for tax incentives to stimulate supply and to keep the current stock of landlords that we have in the market. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously the industry has been calling for this. And to me, it comes down to a real lack of political bravery, to be honest with your voters and say, actually, the only way to address so many of our housing challenges is new supply. And the only way to get new supply is to make it attractive for people to be able to either come in or stay in or develop. And look, I genuinely think that conversation has started to shift in the last 12 months, but that's 5-6 years too late. And I attribute that to a lack of political bravery, notwithstanding what you said there, that, I fully accept that politicians have a difficult job, but I do believe there's been a real lack of bravery to say in public what they are saying in private. And what they're saying in private is that they know the need, like the Help to Buy, while positioned as a buyer's relief, was absolutely a supply side initiative. And if only they'd been brave enough a couple of years ago when that initiative was coming out to say, this is how we tackle supply. And to me, that's been a huge failing, and I don't see that changing.
Well, and first of all, I agree with you. I don't see it changing in the short term. And I also agree with you. I think there's a degree of a lack of bravery. I think it's the way you phrased it, in some of the political decisions that are being made. But I think what people are missing, and what's not being explained to the public, and I think they deserve to understand it, is that actually, if you provide these opportunities for the supply side to be improved, you actually provide the opportunity for more social housing. You provide the opportunity for more first-time buyers. You provide the opportunity for more private rented. It's not that, yes, somebody has to benefit out of this, and likely that the developers will actually make some profit. I think there's a misnomer at the moment that developers are making huge gains at this point in time. At this point in time, I don't think they are, because of the way costs have gone, the way interest rates have gone. They are making money, don't get me wrong, but it's not the obscene levels that used to be there back in the late 90s or early 2000s in the Celtic Tiger times. It is much tighter. But I still think there's room, and this is where I say you bring everybody together, because I still think there's room to do things that help the delivery. So, for example, and it's, this goes back to the 1970s. Now, thankfully, I'm not old enough to remember, but I've read the report several times when the Kenny report came out and said, control land prices. And we're now talking about doing that in different ways. We're not saying it's exactly that, but we're saying, tax on vacant properties, tax on vacant land, tax on zoned land that's unused. That's all controlling land prices. And that's a good thing and should continue. But also, there's also nonsensical elements. So, for example, we heard over the weekend that they're now talking about, I think it's suspending is the word that they use, the development levies. I think that's absolutely right. If we're to, the level of bureaucracy that goes into and cost that goes into just getting to site is very significant. And there's no benefit because you can't be guaranteed you're getting to site. So there's a whole range of things that can be done in respect to that. For example, VAT on social housing is a misnomer. On affordable housing, it's a misnomer. Why have we got it? Because it's a cash flow that goes around the circle of government. So we pay the developer has to pay to the state pays it back to us because we then invest it in more housing. It shouldn't happen. If you take it out, you immediately reduce the cost and you reduce the rent that's being charged on the affordable housing. So there's an immediate benefits that could be there, but it's seen as giving developers a benefit. And the reality is it's not. It's creating additional supply, which if it wasn't there, you don't get the housing that you need. So I agree with you. I think there's some element of bravery that's required, but also just common sense. Bring together some of that thinking that is out there with others. Look, is it? I can't remember which of the scientists it was that said that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different answer, you're insane. And I think we're at that point. Really, we need something that's radically different, and we're not there. The emergency powers bit, I actually do think should be implemented, particularly around planning. And just as an example for Circle, we have a scheme that's in judicial review, has been for 2 years. For 150 apartments that would bring 150 families relief, people who would be living locally. 50% of them would be for social and 50% of them would be affordable housing. So we're bringing that relief to an economy in a particular area that actually needs more people in it to be able to thrive. And that's not happening because of judicial review. I have my own views in respect of it. I'm sure that if I express them, I might be sued, so I'm better not do that. But needless to say, I don't believe that the reasons it's in your judicial review are appropriate reasons to stop something that's really strategic infrastructure.
Yeah, look, to be perfectly honest, that's a view that we hear on this show, certainly on a regular basis. And we know that judicial reviews have been used not for their intended purposes. And, I try not to use the term NIMBY too often on the show here, but there's a huge element of that not in my backyard. There is a huge element, and I fully appreciate that there are some genuine there are some genuine concerns around development, and I understand. And by the way, I'm a huge proponent of public consultation and community engagement.
Absolutely.
In fact, I actually think you touched on a really great point there. And you know what I term probably as lack of political bravery, I think you really kind of pointed to the antidote there, or the possible solution whereby we really involve the community in the decisions. Because in a way, it's quite patronizing to think that the community doesn't understand that actually by stopping development or by the state not empowering the people who can deliver housing, that we're somehow doing the constituency a favour. It's the very opposite. And actually, in a way, if we were to like, planning is a public function. So actually, if we were to explain the mechanisms in a way that actually engages the community and brings them in a more meaningful way, then actually the chances are they would be on board with that. Because even if they're sitting pretty in their 3 or 4 bed semi with the front and back garden and off-street parking, chances are they've adult children or grandchildren who can't afford to rent a room in a house, not to talk about a house, in their 20s and 30s. So I think that's a really great point, maybe not talking down to the community and really engaging them. John, in terms of our social housing targets, because obviously that's been in the news a lot over the last week, are our social housing targets realistic?
Are they realistic? Good point. Good question. I would say they're underestimated as to what they should be. Okay, so for example, I think recent surveys and recent research have shown that we need between 45,000 and 66,000 homes per year for the next 10 years. I would absolutely agree with the research that's gone into that to suggest that. And in fairness, ESRI back in 2016, I think it was suggesting 45,000 homes per year was required on an annual basis for at least 10 years to catch up with what we have. And don't forget, those figures are really looking at what the current demographic is suggesting. It didn't factor in the 80,000 or 160,000, as it might end up being, refugees that we're bringing in from other countries that actually we should be supporting. So I think we are underestimating at this point in time the level of social and affordable housing that's required. The bit we're not projecting, and the bit that we should be projecting, is what we need in the private rented sector. We're not actually talking about it. We're talking about the fact that people are leaving, but I don't hear somebody saying, or anybody saying, what that should look like in terms of what the investment in it should look like, because I think that's a really important part for the future as well, as I keep saying. So are they realistic? No, I think they're too low. Can we deliver them? I don't believe we can do. I don't believe we can deliver the current targets to the extent that we need to. And I know the government have come out and said that they're looking at potentially 33,000 homes per year as being the target. It's not a lack of money, by the way, or a lack of will. It's a lack of resource to actually deliver it. So the people who are actually building brick and brick, or who are using the modern methods of construction in terms of the modular construction, are not available or don't have the capacity. We don't have the people. We know when Housing for All was written that we had 24,000 people short in terms of what we needed within our housing sector to deliver. And it also suggested that we needed a further 80,000 people in order to be able to deliver the extended targets beyond the 2026. So we haven't got the demographic in the country to help us deliver them. And we need to be doing more to make sure we bring them. Now, it's a catch-22 situation. Bring more people, we need more housing. We need more housing to house those people who are going to come. So it is a very difficult one to get right. Again, I believe there's a huge focus on trying to deliver that. But I actually think Housing for All is a really good plan in terms of an overall strategic plan. Like most things and like most plans, the devil's in the detail, and like all good plans, I think it was Mike Tyson, unfortunately, who said it, that as soon as you get hit in the face in the first punch, your plan changes. And I think that's where we're at, where we've had the punch in the face with the pandemic. We've had the punch in the face with the changing in interest rates, with the high levels of inflation. We need to keep modifying. I actually think we need stability in the policy. Mm-hmm. So all of these little additional announcements that are being made, great, but confusing, but stick to the plan if we believe the plan is the right plan for the long term. I think it is. I think the figures overall probably need to be moved, But to do that, we need to bring the additional resources into the country to help deliver that.
I think that's a great point you're making about not so much the construction industry's capacity, because we know that that's ramping up, and in fact they've been frustrated and hamstrung by policy and an unprecedentedly difficult confluence of circumstances, from Brexit to the pandemic to the war in Ukraine. So actually there's been some, I suppose, some factors that were really unprecedented coming together. But through MMC Ireland, we're seeing this huge scaling up and ramping up of capacity in Ireland. That the government, to be fair, is acknowledging and trying to resource. But you're right. We actually need, in order to scale up construction, we need people to do it. And in fact, just this morning, I was reading that a survey released showed that 70% of businesses in Galway are actually reducing their hiring due to accommodation shortages. Now, that's not construction specific, that's all businesses. But 70% of businesses not hiring to the level they were going to hire, not because of business coming in the door or income, but not having places for those people, for those workers to live. That's a huge problem. And I find it so frustrating when you talk about this wall of money. And I think for anybody listening in, that's what they will find the most frustrating, that there is the money there to solve this problem and it's still not being solved. But you're right, the stability is such an important factor. And before we finish up today, and I'm conscious of your time, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And one of the other, because we've talked a little bit about, we can call it political ideology, but it comes down to even simpler terms, and that is, perfect is the enemy of done. And in this, we've seen a lot of criticism in the media around long-term leasing, which, by the way, when you break down the figures, I can understand. However, again, perfect is the enemy of done. So how important is long-term leasing for the moment?
Can I say to you, I think it's absolutely vital. I think of all the decisions that were taken in housing fraud, that was the one that was the incorrect one. And I've been very public in saying this. My view is that, and evidence has shown that on the day that it was announced, effectively we lost nearly 4,000 properties that could have been delivered over a 2-year basis because of the insecurity or the uncertainty that was built into a process now. I actually believe that the government are right to say we need a different agreement. We need a different process. But actually, long-term leasing is has always been in Ireland, and particularly in the bigger cities, Dublin, Cork, Galway, the biggest delivery of homes to people. And I think to have said we're not doing long-term leasing because of vulture funds was the wrong approach. I think they're right to say we want to moderate how investment funds are utilised and what the benefit to the state is longer term in respect to those. So I think it is right to say we need a different deal at the end, or we need a different deal during the process. And in fairness, the targeted leasing initiative was kind of aimed at that. I think it needed a bit of rethink in terms of what it was asking for, but I think there's an opportunity. So for me, I would absolutely advocate for long-term leasing. I think it is an ideal way of ensuring stability, growth, but also certainty for the sector in terms of it takes 2 years to 3 years to build an apartment block. If you're building, as we should be doing, in the right kinds of densities, it takes that period of time. If you haven't got certainty over how that's going to be delivered, if you got certainty how that's going to be funded over the long term, it isn't going to get built. So you immediately take away that opportunity. So for me, I would be advocating very strongly, both from a social, affordable and private sector perspective, that long-term leasing should be available within the country on a greater scale.
And John, how many homes does Circle VHA currently have under management?
We own and manage more than 2,750 homes, and our pipeline for delivery for the next 3 years is nearly 3,000 homes. And
how many people does that equate to? Do you know?
In terms of who we currently, it's nearly 10,000 people in current accommodation, and obviously for the future it'll be nearly 4 times that.
I suppose we're very aware of the difficulties facing everybody across the housing sector, and I work more with the private sector than the public sector, but I have huge admiration for what's been done in the public sector right now. And I suppose I was in this industry at a time, when we had housing charities kind of 20 years ago that were really struggling to make an impact in terms of numbers. And when we look at the scale of delivery across the leading approved housing bodies in Ireland right now, it's phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. So I've huge respect for that. And I think, it's one of the areas that I'm really happy to see resourced. But I'm not naive as to the challenges and how difficult that must be on a daily basis. So I suppose for you as the CEO of Circle VHA, like, what constitutes a good day in work for you?
Well, a great day is when you can hand keys across to people who really need them. That's to be honest, that's why I'm 30 years in the business. I got hooked by the impact that it created 30 years ago, and I'm still here as a result of it. So that's a really good day. A good day is also when you get something that approved from a planning perspective, because that's one of the key difficulties. We're very fortunate in Circle, as are most of our colleagues in the sector, that we have really good funders in terms of the Housing Finance Agency, AIB, Bank of Ireland, others that we work with, and who actually are have invested in really understanding what the sector needs and how it works. I have to also say that one of our key partners is our local authorities, and the local authorities that we work with. We work in 21 different local authorities. If you take some of the bigger associations, they work across every town and every village. And without the local authorities, we wouldn't do what we do. We couldn't do what we do. So we're very appreciative of the work that we do with them. And I find that both the elected officers, but also the executives that work within those, probably don't get as much recognition as they should do because of the difficulties that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I would like to acknowledge them. But so for a good day, good day is being able to say we can deliver more housing. And like we've got, let's say, 3,000 in our pipeline for the next 3 years. We'd like it to be 6,000. We believe we know we have the capacity to deliver that. It's finding those homes, it's getting them to a point where they can be built is the issue.
Very good. John, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. That was John Hannigan, CEO of Circle VHA, and that's all we have time for today. Thanks, again, John, thank you for sharing your expertise and giving us that insight kind of into the third sector. So my thanks today to producer Carol Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out other real estate and construction shows on iPropertyRadio. Huge thanks to our show sponsor, Property District, your industry communications partner, for making these conversations possible. And thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you at the next episode of Property Roundup on iPropertyRadio.